Between the 23rd and 26th of May 2019, I was a guest of the Austrian Wine Marketing Board at their Wine Summit program, which takes place every 2 years. What follows in this series is in-depth coverage of the journey along the Danube stream of the summit. This features a mixture of presentations from members of the Austrian Wine Marketing Board and a combination of presentations and tours of participating wineries. If you've ever wanted to increase your knowledge of Austrian wine, this is the place to be. And do be sure to subscribe to the podcast at interpretingwine.com/listen so that you're alerted when new episodes go live. Today's episode of the Austrian Wine Summit series features Sabine Bauer-Wolf, Head of Communication at the Austrian Wine Marketing Board. A fantastic place to start our journey. Sabine takes us through the 7 elements of Austrian wine presentation, which discusses the 7 factors that characterize wines from the region. Enjoy!
I'm very pleased to meet you all and to have the great honor to start this journey with you. I've heard that we have about 10 different nations here in the audience, and all of you have been in touch with Austrian wine. Some of you are into the topic very deeply. Some of you are here for the first time. So it's a challenge to set the stage for this travel. This is why we are trying to keep it light. I will give you some facts that most of you might probably know, but we will also try to reveal why we think that Austrian wine is so unique. So I will do a mix of facts and soft facts that are just there to make you understand why we love Austrian wine so much and why we hope that you guys will be great multipliers for Austrian wine in the world. So, as Helena has already told you, my name is Sabine. I'm head of communication, which means that in my department we are responsible for all the materials that talk to you. So everything that you can read, see and hear about Austrian wine is derives from my department. And if you have any questions or if you have any specific needs for your markets, please let us know, because we of course always try to improve. Well, we often talk about the 7 elements of uniqueness, but this is nothing that we can just tell you like 1, 2, 3 and that's it. So we try to deep dive into these topics. But at first, we would like to start with some key facts about Austria as a wine country. As you might all know, this is the map of the Austrian generic wine regions. We have a total of 46,000 hectares where we grow wine, and this is about 115,000 acres. We grow wine in all of the districts, but apparently, as you probably know, in the east is the zone where all the specified regions are at home and where most of the wine production takes place. In numbers, well, we produce almost as much as we drink, roughly, and we import a little bit, and this is the portion that we also export. So these are the rough numbers based on average about the last 10 years. So we produce about 250 million liters, and we import and export about 50 to 70 million liters, depending on the vintage. We are very pleased that the export graph has developed like this within the last years. So you can see that the value is steadily growing while the volume stays more or less the same, even though we're also pleased that 2018 the volume could also grow. Why is that? I think that in all of the world we export in about 30 countries. The quality and the specialty about Austrian wine has been recognized, and we realize that the demand is of course rising, and we are very happy that we achieved a value of 117 million in export value. I will try to give you a few arguments or ideas why this journey has been that successful. One of the key elements is, of course, that we do not, or that we almost don't export any bulk wine. So we export quality wine in bottles, and this is where the demand is also steadily rising. Some of you represent our most important export markets. which I would like to show you here in this overview. So this is the graph that shows the 10 most important export markets. Of course, our big neighbor, big brother Germany is our most important market, but we are also proud that we steadily grow a lot of small markets in all around the world, and that Germany, I think 2018 for the first time, fell below 50% of revenue portion. So this means the demand in the rest of the world is steadily increasing, and we're happy to be able to satisfy this. So Switzerland and Liechtenstein are the second most important countries, and then the US, which has shown a 20% plus in 2018 and is steadily rising. The Netherlands are our fourth most important export markets, and then Great Britain, Norway, Sweden, Belgium, also Czech Republic is growing, Canada, and so on. So these are the basic facts. We like to talk about the success, of course, but we also want to understand why the demand for Austrian wine is growing. This is why we identified 7 elements that are, in our opinion, key to the uniqueness of Austrian wine, and that are facts that set us apart from other wine-growing countries. Of course, also other countries have climate, land, and grapes, but we try to show you a little bit during this journey what is so special about the Austrian part of it. So the climate. As you probably all know, this is how Austria looks like. And if we want to put it very simple, then we are popular for skiing in the west. This is why many people visit us in winter. And we are popular for wine in the east. This is how the country looks like. This is where we are located. Some of you come from very far away, so I think it's never a bad idea to show the latitude and longitude of a country, to be able to compare it maybe to regions that you know in France, like Champagne or Burgundy, of course. So we are right in the middle between those two famous regions. So this also shows you that we are definitely in the rather cool climate zone of grape viticulture in Europe. Austria is a very special place in the heart of Europe because we profit from the tension of opposites. So we have, from the east, we have a continental Pannonian influence, which means a lot of sunshine, warm and dry air. While from the west, so the opposite, we have Atlantic climate, which brings wetter and more humid air and also cool breezes. And the same goes for the axis north and south. So from the south, we have the warm Mediterranean climate, and from the north, we have cool air from the north. So these breezes and opposites are constantly fighting with each other, and this is what gives us a very long growing season, a high temperature difference between day and night, and so it allows the grapes to ripen, fully mature, but to always keep the tension, the acidity, and the freshness, which is so special about Austria. Yes, we are still cool climate, as I said, but we are also here to give you a current update on how we experience climate change. So since the 1980s, we have recognized about 2 degrees Celsius increase of temperature. We also noticed that the summers are getting hotter, that we have less snow in winter, which is not true for the last winter, and that we have receding glaciers. The danger that we see and that our winemakers are currently also preparing for is increased danger of drought, floods, hail, mudslides, late frost. So everything that's considered as an extreme weather phenomenon is increasing. We also have, of course, on the horizon, the challenge that pests might survive the winter much easier because it's not so cold, which in total means that on the long run, the higher altitude vineyards might gain interest, but we have plenty of them, and that maybe also resistant grape varieties gain interest. So this is what our winemakers are currently already researching, and what Kloster Neuburg, for example, is also trying to understand how we can react to these changes. So we've seen that also in the last two very warm vintages, we managed to keep the freshness and the acidity and the tension in the wines because we are very aware of these changes. So far, the climate. What about the land? How many of you have been to Austria so far? Okay, just a few. Well, maybe almost a half.
Yeah, not so bad.
Yeah. So I'm sure you have experienced some of the different landscapes already. And I'm sure you've noticed that we are not a country that has vast areas of more or less the same landscape. So you get into the bus or into the car, drive for 20 minutes, and the landscape changes a lot. So this is why we also think that the beautiful and diverse landscape and also the demanding soils that go along with it are very special for Austria. So we cannot plant huge hectares of Grüne Veltliner within the same conditions. We have a lot of winemakers that work in a very small, structured way that always try to express their area, their vineyards in the best possible way. So we have an array of different soils, of course, and this is not everything. There is, of course, also slate, clay, limestone, but these are some of the most prominent soils that we have in Austria and that you will also see while traveling through the vineyards. So there is, of course, gravel everywhere where it gets close to the rivers. There is silt and sand. There were also some volcanoes in former times below the sea or above, where you can see in Styria. You're not going to go there, but you will be able to taste it on Sunday. There are volcanic tuffs or basalt stones. There is löss, which you will see either today or tomorrow, I'm sure, in Kamptal or when you cross Wagram, which is very fine wind-blown silt that gives the typical creaminess to the Veltliners that come from there. And we have crystalline gneiss, which is also very typical for the Wachau. You will probably see as well, I'm sure, which is a metamorphic rock, a weathered type of rock. And then we have conglomerate in all types of stones and minerals and marl. So this is a toolbox where our winemakers can work with. It's not easy to understand, but it also gives you the great flexibility to express your own idea of your wine. The soils is always a difficult topic, so we thought it's maybe easier to understand it when we show you some pictures. So this, of course, is the famous Wachau, where you also see a part of the gneiss and this metamorphic rock that has been carved into terraces all along the Wachau. Basically, in the Wachau, even though you say the predominant soil may be gneiss, it depends totally on the altitude where you have your vineyard. So when you are at the basin, you will find more gravel and sand, of course, and you can make a lighter style of wines. And on the top, it gets cooler, the weather conditions get tougher, and the soil gets poorer. So the wines will be more expressive. This is part of the löss, so of the wind-blown silt that has many meters of diameter sometimes. This is a picture from Kamptal, all beautiful sunny pictures. We hope that you are going to be able to experience it like that, maybe this afternoon. And this is from Neusiedler See, so very different to what you can see all along the Danube. Burgenland is pretty flat, so there we have flat gravel plains. They are quartz-rich and silty, sandy stones, and here the Pannonian climate is very dominant. So we find red wines in Burgenland because they have the ideal conditions. This is one of my favorite pictures. It's from Styria. Some of us call Styria the little Tuscany because, of course, in Austria everything is smaller, but there we have all of these hills and these turns and some very, very steep slopes that are not arranged in terraces, but the slopes really go down the hill. So sometimes it's very difficult and dangerous to drive there. So actually the tractor drivers earn a lot in Styria because you have to be highly qualified to be able to do this task. And there you can also find slate or some of the volcanic stones that I mentioned before. And then, of course, you will all see this, and you will also be able to enjoy this view from the Heurigen or from the Nussberg. So this is Vienna and the wine-growing region Vienna, and with a Wiener gemischter Satz DAC. Many of you might have heard that. This is a specialty where different grape varieties have to be planted and harvested within one field, and they have to be produced into wine, all from this field. I've already mentioned some of the grape varieties, and I think now that we understand that we have a lot of different microclimates, soils, warm, cool air, different altitudes, we also understand that Austria is an ideal country for growing international varieties as well as autochthonous varieties. So all of you know Riesling, Sauvignon Blanc, Muscatella, Pinot Blanc, Chardonnay, etc. And what is special about Austria is, of course, Grüner Veltliner at the forefront. But we also, especially here in the Thermenregion, and I'm sure you're going to taste some of them, we have Zierfandler, Rotgipfler, and Neuburger, so some very old grape varieties that derive from this region, as well as Roter Veltliner, which is very special for Wagram. Easier to understand is maybe this graph that shows you the distribution of the planted grape varieties. So we see that Grüner Veltliner on top is the dominant grape variety with about 1/3 of all the production. Then there is Welsch Riesling, and a lot of other white varieties. So here is where you find Sauvignon Blanc, which is predominant for Styria. This is where you find Muscatella, Pinot Gris, all the whites that we are known for, and about 1/3 of all the planted grape varieties is red, which of course Zweigelt at the forefront, and then Blaufränkisch as the most important red grape variety. In total, we have 40 varieties that are qualified and eligible for making quality wine. And we have amongst them 5 partially fungal resistant varieties, which have been added to the catalog of grape varieties that are eligible for quality wine only recently, and they might become also important in the future. If we look back a few years and see how the grape varieties and the distribution has developed, we see that in the 90s, the proportion of red wines was a little bit smaller, and then red wines gained in importance. It was the trend that also our winemakers followed the international trend for international grape varieties, also for Merlot and Cabernet. This was at the beginning of the 2000s, but then we kind of discovered what we can do best and what we are known for. And recently we see again that the white varieties are growing, and that we have again about 1/3 of Grüner Veltliner, which has been slightly diminished at the beginning of the 2000s. Talking about the culture, of course we think that the mindset of our winemakers is a very important factor when it comes to how the wine will taste in the end and how it will develop. So what you will be able to see when you travel through Austria is that on the one hand we have great traditional buildings. So this would be, for example, a typical Kellergasse, we call it, so a cellar street.
Yeah.
Where the wines have been stored and matured in former times. So this is maybe where the grandfathers of our young winemakers have been working a lot. You see this in Weinviertel, for example. Nowadays you can visit it and enjoy a nice Heurigen food there. Or we even have some kind of small castles that have been built around wine. This is, for example, at Domäne Wachau, which you are also going to visit within the next days. Or we have also traditional places like the Göttweg Abbey in Kremstal. This is where monks still live today and where also a winery is still located today. So there is Stift Göttweg, which also produces its own wine. So this shows the tradition and the long history of wine in Austria. While you can also see buildings like this, which is Weingut Esterhazy at Leiterberg, or the Loisium, which you are going to visit.
Be there as well, yes.
Mm-hmm. So this is not only a winery, this is also a wine experience building. Or you can see tasting rooms like this, which is from Weingut Neumeister in Styria, for example. So you see that this tension between the history, the old generation, and the young winemakers that realize their own ideas creates very interesting wines and also interesting stories to tell. So I always love to visit our winemakers and to ask them. For example, 2 days ago there was the challenge of the young winemakers that win the Salon, which is a very important competition in wine that we hold in Austria. And they can participate, they have to be below 30 years, and they have to be already responsible for making their own wines. And the winner was a 22-year-old lady, and she had a personality and very impressive wines. So this is what makes it so interesting. And she is standing there presenting her wine along with her father and her grandma, actually. So these are the stories that you experience all along the way. So why is it that all the winemakers have stories and character and are not just producing wine? We like to compare ourselves sometimes to Australia because it's very easy to grasp. We are pretty small compared to Australia. Also, the wine growing region is much smaller. Australia has about 160,000 hectares. But if you look at the number of bottlers, we have 4,000 bottlers, roughly, and Australia has only about 2,200 bottlers. So this shows the small scale of the winemaking business in Austria. So it's family business, although it's at a very high level of quality, because since we have very good schools, the young generation nowadays has had the best education in wine, has traveled all around the world, of course, and might have had a traineeship in Australia or in California, wherever, but they tend to come back and then realize their philosophy back home in their own wineries. Yes, so we have about 14,000 growers, but only about 4,000 bottlers. The average size per grower is only 3.22 hectare. This increased a lot, so if you see 2009, the average size was even much smaller. For you internationally, probably most interesting are bottlers that produce above about 30,000 liters, because this is roughly an amount where we would say that's enough to export and to be interesting for the world wine market. So in 2017, we had about two-thirds of the producers that are below this 30,000 liter mark, but 1,500 above. So if you say Australia, 2,200 bottlers, we have 1,400 that are interesting and available in all of the world for you all to taste in the end. So much about the structure and about the figures. What's also very interesting, of course, is nature. So wine is a product of nature. Many winemakers say, I don't do that much in the cellar because what counts is the work in the vineyard and what nature does. And we are proud that the Austrian agriculture in total is about 21% organic, and that the organic wine rose within the last years up to 14% of organically produced grapes. And apart from that, we have 7% of the wine growing region that is certified sustainable. I will talk about this in a minute. And the rest, or about 75%, use a technology that's called minimum intervention. So, of course, everybody tries to grow the grapes with nature and with as less amount of interference as possible. That's also why we have low yields of about 67 hectoliters per hectare, which is pretty low on an international scale. We have two certifications or two labels that you can find on the bottles if you want to be sure if the wine has been produced from organically farmed grapes. Then you can always look out for the EU logo for biologically and organically produced grapes. And in Austria, we are one of the few countries that takes sustainability very seriously. So there is a program that regulates and that also controls who can use this sign and who is allowed to talk about sustainable produced wines. So sustainability has more dimensions. It's of course about how the grapes are farmed, but it also has an economic and an economic portion. So the winery has to work sustainable in economic figures, and also there's a social dimension to it. So it's two different concepts that can also work together very well. In the end, now that we've told you about the special factors and the quality of bad Austrian wine, in the end, the customer, the consumer in front of the shelf is also interested in the price. We are proud to say that we think that Austria can offer the greatest values in fine wine. We more or less left the lowest entry level, so we've seen the volume. So there is not that much wine that we can produce it super cheap and export it in all the world. That's not what we are striving for. But we can produce very good qualities from 3 to 5 euros ex cellar. And the top wines you can already get from between 10 to 20 euros ex cellar, which is compared on an international level really good value for money. You will be able to taste the wines and, of course, convince yourself. But what we see is that from 30 euros, you get really world-class wines, iconic wines from iconic grape-growing regions in Austria. While if you compare it to the icons of California or Burgundy, the Austrian icons are, of course, way cheaper. There is a hierarchy that can be applied and that has a ratio to the price, of course. So roughly, there are wines on a generic region. So when you find on a label Niederösterreich, Burgenland, Styria, this is the generic region. Above, when you have a more detailed origin, are wines from specified regions like Wagram, Wachau, Weinviertel, or also some regions that show a DAC. I will talk about this in a minute. And then there are even smaller origins, like a village appellation or a cruise, so an appellation that only talks about the single vineyard where a wine comes from. And depending on the position in the pyramid, of course, the wine is also expected to have a higher level of concentration, more character, a higher level of complexity, more potential for development, and more expression of origin. So the higher or the more specified the origin on the label, the more character the wine will have and the more it will speak to the place where it comes from. This is again the wine map where you see the specified grape growing regions that we have as of May 2019, so right now. We have 13 DAC regions. We have 4 specified regions and 4 generic regions. So only Wachau, Carnuntum, Thermenregion and Wagram do not have a DAC yet, even though they also have a profile, but we will hear about that later, I'm sure. Yes, all of these wines are eligible for to produce quality wine, which you can always recognize by this sign, by the banderole, as we call it, on top of the bottle. What does DAC mean? I'm sure most of you came along this term. So this stands for Districtus Austriae Controllatus and means that it is, what you have in your glass or in your bottle, a quality wine from a specified region, and that this region or that the regional wine committees, which is made out of representatives from winemakers, but also from the business side of the region, and they discuss what is representative for the region. And when they can agree on a special focus, then they will submit this regulation to the National Wine Committee, and then in the end the Agricultural Ministry will put it into legislation, and from this time on a region can have a DAC, which guarantees the distinct flavor profile that the region has developed. Talking about taste. Last but not least, we think that, well, set aside all the arguments, we think that in the end, what you have in the glass, the taste, has to speak for itself and has to convince our customers all around the world. But what is so nice about Austrian wine? In the beginning, I said it's very diverse, but it's always fresh. It always has character and tension, and it will always have a good acidity and tension. And this is also what makes it so versatile, because we like to say that Austrian wine is everywhere at home. We are very tiny, but we like to match ourselves with culinary expressions from all around the world. So try it, we did. This is why we have many brochures that also show you how Austrian wine can be paired with Mediterranean cuisine, with Asian cuisine. I think we did one for Indian once as well. Yes. Cheese. So we invite you, of course, to try this. And if you take a close look, you will also notice that Austrian wine has made its way onto the wine menus of the best restaurants of the world, the best established restaurants, but also rookie and young sommeliers love Austria because there are also our young winemakers that make very interesting wines, also for small-scale production and for wines that represent everything that's outside of mainstream. So there was one smart person, who is called Willy Klinger, I think, who put it in a nutshell and said, there is simply no other place on earth where the refreshing wines are so concentrated or where the opulent wines exhibit such grace. I think this sums it up pretty well, and I invite you to experience this quote for yourselves within the next days, and I hope you have a great journey. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sabine. As I say, a fantastic way to kick off the proceedings. Do, of course, be sure to check out the website and main social media handles for Austrian Wine below. This being the first of this 9-part series, do be sure to subscribe to the podcast if you haven't already. Just head to interpretingwine.com/listen. And if you haven't already, I would love to have you following along with me on social media, where I'm at Interpreting Wine on Instagram and Facebook, at Wine Podcast on Twitter, and email hello@interpretingwine.com. See you next time in episode 357, where we do a deep dive into the Thermen Region. See you then.